The television courtroom had never felt so tense. Camera operators adjusted their lenses, capturing what they assumed would be another routine small claims dispute. The audience settled into their seats, expecting the usual back-and-forth drama that made Judge Judy America's most-watched daytime court show. But what was about to unfold in the next 17 minutes would become the most viral courtroom moment in television history, shared over 50 million times across every social media platform imaginable. This wasn't just another case. This was the moment when entitled arrogance collided with the one thing that should never be disrespected, a decorated war hero's dignity. And Judge Judy's face, her legendary expression of pure disgust, would say everything that words couldn't capture. 78-year-old Robert Henderson sat quietly in the plaintiff's chair, his worn hands folded over a simple manila folder containing his documentation. His posture was straight despite the slight limp he'd walked in with, a permanent reminder of shrapnel that had torn through his leg while saving his platoon from an ambush in the jungles of Vietnam 55 years ago. A small service pin adorned his modest jacket, the only outward indication that the soft-spoken gentleman in apartment 4B was a two-time Purple Heart recipient, a Bronze Star holder, and a man who had pulled 23 wounded soldiers from the battlefield while enemy fire rained down around him. He hadn't wanted to come to court. Fighting wasn't in his nature anymore. But when Karen Mitchell had sued him for $5,000 over a parking spot, the parking spot that was legally assigned to his apartment because of his service-connected disability, he knew he had no choice but to defend himself. Karen Mitchell sat across from him in the defendant's chair, but everything about her posture screamed that she believed she was the real plaintiff here. Her designer outfit was carefully chosen to project success and superiority. The leather portfolio in her lap contained what she called evidence, though Judge Judy's experienced eye had already spotted 17 inconsistencies in Karen's initial paperwork before anyone had spoken a single word. Karen's BMW key fob sat prominently on the table in front of her, a not-so-subtle reminder that she was a successful real estate agent who believed her professional status elevated her above other residents in their modest apartment complex. She had checked her phone 3 times since entering the courtroom, each time with an exaggerated sigh that suggested this entire proceeding was beneath her valuable time. When she'd walked past Robert earlier, she hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't made eye contact, had treated the 78-year-old combat veteran like he was invisible. That dismissive attitude had been noted by every single person in the courtroom, especially by the woman sitting behind the bench whose career had been built on reading people within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. Judge Judy Scheindlin had presided over more than 20,000 cases in her legendary career. She had seen every variety of liar, every breed of scammer, every type of entitled person who thought volume and attitude could substitute for facts and evidence. But something about this case had caught her attention the moment she reviewed the files the night before. A 78-year-old disabled veteran being sued by a woman 40 years his junior over a handicapped parking spot. The parking spot that was legally assigned to his unit. The parking spot he needed because combat injuries made it difficult for him to walk long distances. And Karen Mitchell had the audacity to sue him for emotional distress because he had the nerve to ask her to stop parking in his assigned space. Judge Judy had spent the evening digging deeper into Karen's history, and what she discovered had made her blood boil in a way that even decades of judicial experience couldn't cool. Before we dive into the moment that broke the internet, before we show you Judge Judy's legendary facial expression that became 1,000 memes, before we reveal how this entitled Karen's world came crashing down around her, make sure you hit that like button right now if you support our veterans and believe that respect isn't optional. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these incredible moments when disrespect meets consequences and entitled people learn that some things are sacred. Trust me, what you're about to witness will restore your faith in justice and remind you that karma doesn't just exist, it has perfect timing and sometimes it wears a black robe. The next 17 minutes will show you exactly what happens when someone thinks they're too important to show basic human decency to a war hero, and Judge Judy's silent response will be more devastating than anything words could ever express. The case was simple on its surface. Robert Henderson versus Karen Mitchell. A parking spot dispute in their shared apartment building. But this wasn't really about parking. This was about respect, about entitlement, about a woman who had spent 3 years terrorizing her neighbors because she believed her success gave her the right to treat others as obstacles to her convenience. This was about a decorated veteran who had given everything for his country, who walked with a permanent limp because he'd thrown himself on top of a wounded soldier to shield him from enemy fire, being treated like his service meant nothing. And this was about Judge Judy, who was about to deliver a lesson in accountability that would echo through social media for years to come. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. And Karen Mitchell had no idea she was about to become the most hated woman on the internet. Judge Judy's voice cut through the courtroom with the precision of a surgical blade. "Ms. Mitchell, you're suing Mr. Henderson for $5,000. Tell me why." It was a simple opening question, the kind she had asked thousands of times before, but the way Karen responded immediately revealed everything Judge Judy needed to know about who she was dealing with. Karen didn't just answer. She launched into a performance that would have made Broadway actors cringe with secondhand embarrassment. "Your Honor," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sophistication that screamed entitlement from every syllable, "this man has made my life absolutely unbearable for the past 6 months. He harasses me constantly about a parking spot, follows me around the building, and has created such a hostile living environment that I've had to seek therapy for the emotional distress he's caused me." The words tumbled out with practiced precision, each one carefully chosen to paint Robert as some kind of aggressive stalker rather than a quiet 78-year-old veteran who simply wanted to park in his legally assigned handicapped spot. Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly, that first warning sign that experienced viewers recognized immediately as trouble brewing beneath her calm exterior. Karen continued her theatrical presentation, pulling papers from her leather portfolio with flourishes that suggested she believed she was starring in her own legal drama. "I have documentation here showing the emotional toll this has taken on me, Your Honor. Text messages from friends where I describe my anxiety. Receipts from therapy sessions. Even a letter from my doctor about the stress-related headaches I've developed because of his constant harassment." She laid each piece of paper on the table with exaggerated care, never once looking at Robert, never once acknowledging him as a human being worthy of basic respect. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face in that signature pose that meant she was processing information and finding it severely lacking. "Ms. Mitchell, you keep using the word harassment. Define that for me. What specifically did Mr. Henderson do that constitutes harassment?" It was a trap, though Karen was too wrapped up in her own narrative to recognize it. "Well, Your Honor, he would knock on my door when I parked in the spot. He'd leave notes on my windshield. He even complained to the building manager about me multiple times. It was constant persecution over something as trivial as a parking space." Judge Judy's expression shifted slightly, a micro-movement that court regulars knew meant she'd just caught Karen in something significant. "You just called it trivial. But you're suing for $5,000 over something you yourself describe as trivial." "Interesting." Karen's confident facade flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "I meant the parking spot itself is trivial, Your Honor, but the harassment and emotional damage are very real. This man has terrorized me simply because I occasionally needed to use that spot for convenience when I had heavy shopping bags or when it was raining. He acts like he owns it just because his apartment number is on the sign." The audience stirred slightly at that comment, a low murmur of disapproval that Karen either didn't hear or chose to ignore. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed further. "His apartment number is on the sign because it's assigned to his apartment, correct?" Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Technically, yes, but these are community parking spaces, Your Honor. I pay rent in that building too. Why should he get special treatment just because he's older?" That last comment hung in the air like poison gas, and Judge Judy's expression could have frozen water at 20 paces. But she didn't explode, not yet. She was a predator, and she knew that letting Karen continue to talk was the best way to let her dig her own grave deeper and deeper. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Judy said, turning her attention to the elderly veteran who had sat quietly through Karen's entire performance, "tell me your side of this story." Robert shifted slightly in his chair, his voice soft and measured when he spoke. "Your Honor, I don't want to make a big fuss about this. It's really quite simple. The parking spot in question is assigned to my apartment unit, number 4B, because I have a medical need to park close to the building entrance. You see, I have difficulty walking long distances due to an injury I sustained years ago." He reached into his manila folder with slightly trembling hands and pulled out official-looking documents. "I have a handicapped parking placard issued by the VA, a doctor's note explaining my mobility limitations, and the lease agreement clearly showing that parking spot number 12 is designated for apartment 4B. Ms. Mitchell has been parking in that spot regularly for the past 6 months despite multiple requests from myself and the building manager for her to use one of the unreserved spots that are available just 30 feet away." His voice remained calm, almost apologetic, as if he felt bad for taking up the court's time with something he clearly viewed as a minor issue compared to what others might be facing. "I wouldn't have minded so much, Your Honor, except on several occasions I came home from my VA medical appointments only to find her car in my spot, which meant I had to park in the far lot and walk nearly 200 yards with my leg giving me considerable pain. Judge Judy nodded slowly, her respect for this man's dignity evident in the softness that entered her expression when she looked at him. "Mr. Henderson, you mentioned an injury. Tell me about that." Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with drawing attention to himself. "Your Honor, I don't want to." Robert's voice carried the weight of humility that came from a lifetime of service without seeking recognition. "Your Honor, I don't want to make this about me or turn this into something bigger than it needs to be. The injury isn't important to the case." Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice taking on that edge of steel wrapped in silk that regular viewers knew meant she wasn't asking anymore, she was commanding. "Mr. Henderson, I'll decide what's relevant to this case. You mentioned you have difficulty walking due to an injury. I'd like to know the nature of that injury and how it affects your need for that parking spot. Please continue." Robert nodded respectfully, understanding that this wasn't optional anymore. "Yes, Your Honor. You see, back in 1968, I was serving in Vietnam as a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division. We were on patrol in the Central Highlands when our platoon came under heavy enemy fire from a concealed position." His voice remained steady, but there was something in his eyes, a distance that suggested he was seeing things that happened over 50 years ago as clearly as if they'd occurred yesterday. "We had 3 men down in an exposed position, and the enemy fire was intensifying. I was moving to reach the wounded when I saw movement in the tree line that indicated an ambush was about to hit our position from the flank. I managed to get to 2 of the wounded men and drag them to cover, but when I went back for the 3rd soldier, a grenade landed approximately 4 feet from where Private First Class Jimmy Chen was lying wounded. I threw myself over him to shield him from the blast, and the shrapnel tore through my left leg, shattering that's when it happened. That's when Karen Mitchell made the single biggest mistake of her entire life. That's when she interrupted a decorated combat veteran in the middle of describing how he'd saved a fellow soldier's life, and in doing so, sealed her fate in Judge Judy's courtroom forever. Oh God, here we go with the war stories again." Karen's voice cut through Robert's testimony like nails on a chalkboard, her tone dripping with dismissive contempt that made every person in that courtroom freeze in shock. She actually rolled her eyes dramatically and waved her hand in a gesture that suggested Robert's service was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her important lawsuit. "Your Honor, he does this constantly. He uses this whole veteran thing to manipulate people into giving him sympathy and special treatment. It's honestly exhausting." The words kept coming, each one worse than the last, each syllable digging her grave deeper while she remained completely oblivious to the devastation she was bringing down on herself. "We've all made sacrifices in life, Your Honor. Some of us have worked real jobs and built actual careers instead of living off the government and expecting everyone to worship us for something that happened half a century ago." The silence that followed was so profound, so absolutely deafening, that even the camera operators forgot to adjust their equipment. The audience sat frozen, mouths literally hanging open in shock at what they'd just witnessed. The court stenographer's hand stopped moving over her keyboard as if her brain couldn't process what it had just heard enough to type it. The bailiff, a former Marine who had seen countless disrespectful defendants in his years of service, looked like someone had just slapped him across the face. Robert Henderson sat perfectly still, his dignity intact but something flickering in his eyes, a pain that had nothing to do with shrapnel wounds and everything to do with having his service, his sacrifice, his very humanity dismissed as manipulation by someone who had never given anything to anyone but herself. But the most powerful reaction in that courtroom came from Judge Judy Scheindlin, and it wasn't a volcanic explosion of judicial fury. It wasn't a screaming tirade or a dramatic gaveling or any of the theatrical responses that lesser judges might have employed. No, what Judge Judy did was far more devastating. She simply stared at Karen Mitchell with an expression that conveyed more contempt, more disgust, more absolute judgment than any words could ever express. Her eyes narrowed into slits that could cut through steel. Her jaw clenched so tight that muscles stood out along her face. Her head tilted slightly to one side in that unmistakable gesture that communicated a single message: "I cannot believe a human being just said what you said." The silence stretched for 5 full seconds that felt like 5 full years, and in those seconds, that face, that legendary expression of pure revulsion, was being captured by multiple cameras from multiple angles, immortalizing the moment for internet history. Karen, incredibly, still didn't understand the magnitude of what she'd just done. She actually looked slightly pleased with herself, as if she believed she'd scored a point by cutting through what she viewed as Robert's sympathy-seeking testimony. She glanced at the audience with an expression that seemed to say, "You're all thinking it, I just had the courage to say it," completely misreading the room in a way that would have been comical if it weren't so deeply offensive. She shifted in her chair, adjusted her designer handbag, and waited for Judge Judy to move on with the case, utterly convinced that her interruption had been justified and even helpful to expediting these proceedings. She had no idea that Judge Judy's silence was the calm before a storm that would destroy not just her case, but her reputation, her business, and her ability to ever show her face in public again without being recognized as the woman who disrespected a Purple Heart recipient on national television. Judge Judy's voice, when it finally came, was so quiet that everyone in the courtroom had to lean forward to hear it. But that quietness was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Mrs. Mitchell." 2 words, spoken with the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned attorneys wet themselves. "Did you just interrupt this veteran's testimony about how he was wounded saving another soldier's life?" Karen, still clueless, actually nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, because I think we need to focus on the actual case here, which is about a parking spot, not about." "Stop talking." The command came out of Judge Judy's mouth with the force of a gunshot, cutting Karen off mid-sentence and causing her to physically recoil as if she'd been struck. "Stop talking right now before you make this exponentially worse for yourself, which I honestly didn't think was possible 30 seconds ago, but you keep surprising me with new depths of disrespect." Judge Judy's hands were flat on her desk, her posture rigid with barely controlled anger, and every person in that courtroom understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just another case of Judge Judy dressing down a difficult litigant. This was personal. This had crossed a line that even decades of judicial experience couldn't prepare someone to handle with complete professional detachment. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Judy said, her voice softening immediately as she turned back to the veteran, the contrast between how she addressed him versus how she'd just spoken to Karen making her contempt even more obvious. "Please continue. Tell me about your injury and your service. Take all the time you need." Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, clearly not wanting to make this into a bigger situation than it already was. "Your Honor, I really don't need to go into all the details. The important thing is just that I have a documented disability that qualifies me for the handicapped parking spot, and I have all the legal paperwork to prove." Judge Judy held up her hand gently. "Mr. Henderson, humor me. I want to hear about your service. I want this courtroom and everyone watching at home to hear about what you did for this country. Please." Robert took a deep breath and continued, his voice steady despite the emotion that flickered across his weathered face. "After the Grenade explosion, I spent 8 months in military hospitals undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage to my left leg. The doctors wanted to amputate at first, but I refused because I wanted to get back to my unit. I eventually recovered enough to return to limited duty, but I was never the same physically. I served 2 more tours despite the injury because my brothers were still over there, and I couldn't leave them." He pulled out a small folder from his manila envelope, and the documents inside told a story that made Karen's petty lawsuit look even more contemptible by comparison. "I received 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat, a Bronze Star with Valor for the action where I was injured, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry for medical aid provided under fire during the Tet Offensive." Judge Judy examined the documents with visible respect, her expression when looking at Robert's service record standing in stark contrast to the disgust that returned to her face every time she glanced at Karen. "And the parking spot, Mr. Henderson. Explain to me exactly why you need that specific spot." Robert nodded, grateful to move past talking about his service. "Your Honor, the assigned spot is only 40 feet from my apartment entrance. When I have to park in the far lot, as I've had to do repeatedly when Ms. Mitchell takes my spot, I have to walk nearly 200 yards, and by the time I reach my apartment, my leg is in significant pain. On cold or rainy days, it's even worse because the old injury aches terribly in bad weather. I have a letter here from my VA doctor explaining that minimizing the distance I have to walk is medically necessary for managing my service-connected disability." Judge Judy took the letter, read it thoroughly, and then did something that made the audience lean forward in anticipation. She pulled out a thick folder that had been sitting on her desk since before the case began, a folder that Karen hadn't noticed because she'd been too busy being dismissive and self-absorbed. "Mrs. Mitchell, while we're discussing parking spots and who deserves what, I think there are some things about your background that are very relevant to this case." Karen's face showed the first flicker of genuine concern, a crack in her armor of entitlement that suggested some part of her brain was finally recognizing that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. "Your Honor, I don't see what my background has to do with," Judge Judy's voice cut through the air like a whip. "I said stop talking. You've talked enough. Now you're going to listen." Judge Judy opened the folder with deliberate slowness, letting the anticipation build, letting Karen squirm in her chair as she wondered what could possibly be in those pages. "Mrs. Mitchell, this isn't your first harassment lawsuit, is it?" The color began draining from Karen's face as Judge Judy continued. "In fact, you filed 3 previous lawsuits against neighbors in your apartment building. All 3 were dismissed because the judges found your claims to be without merit and, in one case, potentially fraudulent. You sued an elderly woman on the 2nd floor for making too much noise, when building records showed she was hearing impaired and barely left her apartment. You sued a young couple on the 3rd floor for letting their baby cry, demanding they pay for your sleep disruption. You sued the building maintenance worker for harassment when he asked you to stop propping open the security door." The pattern was clear, and Judge Judy laid it out with prosecutorial precision that came from decades of seeing through exactly this kind of behavior. You have a documented history of targeting people you perceive as vulnerable, people you think won't fight back, and using the legal system as a weapon to bully them into submission. The building manager provided a statement that I found very enlightening. Would you like to know what it says? Karen's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, those cases were misunderstandings." Judge Judy wasn't finished. The building manager states, and I quote, "Ms. Mitchell has created a hostile environment for multiple residents, particularly targeting elderly tenants and those who appear unlikely to have resources to fight back legally. She has repeatedly violated building policies while simultaneously reporting minor infractions by others. The situation with Mr. Henderson is consistent with her pattern of behavior." Judge Judy closed the folder and fixed Karen with a stare that could melt concrete. "You didn't just choose Mr. Henderson randomly, did you? You specifically targeted a 78-year-old veteran living on a fixed income because you thought he wouldn't be able to afford to fight back. You thought you could bully him into giving up his legally assigned handicapped parking spot through sheer legal harassment. And when he dared to stand up for himself, when he dared to document your violations and report them to management, you decided to retaliate by suing him for $5,000 that you knew he couldn't afford to pay." The transformation in Karen Mitchell was complete and devastating. The confident real estate agent who had strutted into the courtroom with her designer outfit and leather portfolio was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling woman whose hands shook as the full weight of her public humiliation crashed down on her shoulders. Judge Judy wasn't done. She had one more piece of evidence that would seal Karen's fate forever and ensure that this case became a lesson in accountability that would echo through social media for years to come. "Mrs. Mitchell, let's talk about your so-called evidence of emotional distress. You submitted therapy bills claiming Mr. Henderson's harassment caused you severe anxiety and stress-related headaches, correct?" Karen nodded weakly, unable to find her voice anymore. Judge Judy pulled out another set of documents, and the expression on her face suggested she was about to detonate a bomb that would leave nothing but rubble. "Interesting thing about submitting false evidence to a court, Mrs. Mitchell. It's called perjury, and it's a crime. These therapy bills you submitted are dated during the period when you claim Mr. Henderson was causing you such severe emotional distress. But I had my team do some checking." Judge Judy held up printouts that made Karen visibly flinch. "These are screenshots from your social media accounts during that exact same time period. Here's you on a wine tour in Napa Valley, captioning your photos, 'Living my best life.' Here's you at a luxury spa resort, posting about how relaxed and stress-free you feel. Here's you hosting parties at your apartment, the same apartment where you claim you were too anxious and stressed to function because of Mr. Henderson's alleged harassment. And my personal favorite, here's you posting in a neighborhood Facebook group complaining about the old man in 4B who thinks he's special because he's a veteran, asking if anyone else is tired of people using their military service as an excuse for special treatment." The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs that Judge Judy had to quiet with her gavel. Karen's face had gone from pale to bright red, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that every lie, every exaggeration, every piece of manufactured evidence had been systematically dismantled by a judge who had done her homework and wasn't about to let entitled bullying go unpunished. "Your Honor, I can explain," Karen's voice cracked, but Judge Judy held up her hand with finality. "There is nothing to explain, Mrs. Mitchell. You filed a fraudulent lawsuit against a disabled veteran, submitted false evidence to this court, and demonstrated breathtaking disrespect for a man who sacrificed his health and well-being in service to this country. But what makes your behavior truly reprehensible is that you did all of this not out of any legitimate grievance, but purely because you wanted a parking spot that wasn't yours and you were willing to destroy an elderly man's peace and financial security to get it. Judge Judy's final ruling came down like thunder, each word punctuated with the kind of authority that had made her a legend in American courtroom television. Your case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning you can never bring this claim again. You are ordered to pay Mr. Henderson $5,000 for the legal fees, time, and emotional distress you caused him with this frivolous lawsuit. You are never to park in his assigned spot again, never to contact him directly or indirectly, and never to speak to him for any reason whatsoever. I am forwarding copies of this proceeding to your building management with a recommendation that they review your lease agreement for violations of community standards. I am also forwarding the evidence of your false statements to the district attorney's office for review of potential perjury charges. The gavel came down with such force that it echoed through the stunned courtroom like a gunshot. But Judge Judy wasn't quite finished. She turned to Robert Henderson, and her voice softened in a way that made it clear she was speaking not as a judge but as one human being to another who deserved recognition and respect. Mr. Henderson, thank you for your service to this country. I apologize that you had to endure this woman's harassment and that you had to come to my courtroom to get the basic respect and dignity you should have received from day one. You are a hero, sir, and I want you to know that this court recognizes your sacrifice and honors your service. Robert stood slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion, and nodded with quiet dignity. Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to park near my apartment and live in peace. Judge Judy smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her judicial demeanor. You've more than earned that right, Mr. Henderson. And I promise you, Ms. Mitchell will not be bothering you again. Karen was escorted from the courtroom by the bailiff, her sobs echoing down the hallway as audience members watched her exit with expressions of pure satisfaction. Several veterans in the audience stood and saluted as Robert made his way out, and the spontaneous show of respect brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. What happened next transformed this case from a courtroom victory into a cultural phenomenon that would be discussed for years. Within 3 hours of the episode airing, the clip of Karen interrupting Robert's testimony had been viewed over 10 million times across social media platforms. Judge Judy's legendary face of disgust became an instant meme, shared with captions like, "When someone disrespects a veteran, the look that launched 1,000 consequences," and "This is what happens when Karen meets actual authority." The hashtag #RespectOurVeterans began trending globally within 6 hours, with millions of people sharing the video and their own stories of veterans who deserved recognition and respect. Karen Mitchell's real identity was discovered by internet detectives within 24 hours, and the consequences were swift and merciless. Her real estate license came under review after dozens of complaints flooded the licensing board. Former clients came forward with stories of her aggressive behavior and questionable business practices. Her apartment building management reviewed her lease and found multiple violations that led to her eviction within 60 days. She lost over 70% of her client base as people refused to work with someone who had publicly disrespected a war hero on national television. Meanwhile, Robert Henderson's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. A GoFundMe campaign established by moved viewers raised over $200,000 to help with his medical expenses and ensure a comfortable retirement. Veterans organizations across the country reached out to honor him at ceremonies he had previously avoided out of humility. His apartment building not only guaranteed his parking spot for life but waived his rent for an entire year as an apology for the harassment he'd endured. Most importantly, Robert finally received the recognition and respect he had earned but never sought. The case became required viewing in military appreciation courses and legal ethics classes as the perfect example of why respect matters and what happens when entitlement meets accountability. If this story of justice and respect moved you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you never miss another moment where entitled behavior meets its match in Judge Judy's courtroom. Hit that like button if you believe Karen got exactly what she deserved, and comment below to share your thoughts on people who think they're too important to show respect to those who served. Share this video with someone who needs to see what real accountability looks like, because in Judge Judy's world and in a just society, disrespecting a veteran isn't just wrong, it comes with consequences that last forever.